Hello, I'm Tony,
I'm Patrick.
and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. We are at the last chapter of J.P. Moreland's book, Science and Scientism, and he's going to now give us a plan for the integration of Christianity and science. And so we want to take a look at how he suggests that we can integrate both Christianity and science together. He's been suggesting that they're not really at odds with each other. The previous chapter, he said 95% of the things that they talk about don't even overlap, right? They're different, right? And the important things in each one. And so now this 15th chapter is his plan for integration. So let's kind of dive in and see how he suggests we should do this. He says when problem areas surface in the attempt to integrate Christianity and science, Christians, he tells us, need to think hard about the issues in light of the need for strengthening the rational authority of Christian theism and placing it squarely within the plausibility structure of contemporary culture. So what is he getting at here? Well, he wants to make sure that Christianity is, that we put it as part of the discussion, make it part of the discussion with regard to the plausibility, the things that we find true or rational or justified or whatever in the contemporary culture. And he says one addresses problems like these. When we do that, there will emerge a number of different ways that theology can interact with an issue in a discipline outside of theology. And so he's going to work through a few of those.
Very first one that he brings up as a particular strategy is what he calls here the two realms model. So this strategy for addressing conflicts between theology and other disciplines is based on the idea that propositions, theories, and methodologies in theology and another discipline, such as science, may involve two distinct, non-overlapping areas of integration. For example, debates about angels or the existence of the atonement have little to do with organic chemistry. And he mentioned this in the last chapter about how 95% of all claims, both either on the historical side or on the science side or on the theology side, tend to not overlap. So this might have a tie-in here. Well, similarly, it is of little interest to theology whether a methane molecule has 3 or 4 hydrogen atoms in it. So the two realms or domains are focusing on different areas of investigation. Can you give me a clipping of God's toenail? Well, God isn't a physical being like that. Well, then, therefore, you have no scientific explanation for God, and I can reject him because I don't have a toenail clipping of God. We're talking about two different realms here. So we can't give you a toenail clipping because you're only a physicalist, and I can't do that. Well, then I don't believe in your God. Well, my God doesn't have that type of physical belief. Okay, so there's the two realms model. They're divergent, two divergent.
Right. So there's two different areas of investigation, right? The two are and they're separate. So that's one kind of model that he is suggesting here. Secondly, he says there's the complementary model. And he says this second strategy is based on the idea that propositions, theories, or methodologies in theology and other disciplines such as science may involve two different complementary, non-interacting approaches to the same reality. So what's he getting at here? Well, he says when this model is used, the two disciplines are referring to the same object, but from different perspectives, offering partial descriptions at different levels and with different vocabulary. So this is two different but complementary, non-interacting approaches, right? So they're looking at the same thing from different perspectives, we might say. So, for instance, he says the proposition water is formed by God and the proposition water is formed by a synthesis reaction of hydrogen and oxygen are both true, right? Hydrogen and oxygen synthesis plus or God. Both of those statements, those propositions are true. And he says neither one purports to tell the whole story, but both make truth claims about reality. They complement each other from different angles. So that's the complementarian kind of model. And of course, now he's going to have some issues with this model, as we will see here.
Right. So why does the 8-ball go into the pocket? Well, the white billiard ball hit it. Well, no, it was because of the pool player with the pool stick. Well, they both can't be right?
Right. Yeah.
No, they certainly can. Each one complements the other here.
Right. Neither tells the whole story, right? But they look at the story from the activity, the event from different perspectives.
Right. Yes. All right. So there is a significant danger, however, in this approach. Well, okay, why? Well, because it can have an effect and de-supernaturalize the world and undercut our ability to detect God's direct miraculous actions in the world. For example, in this way, the complementary view kills the idea that direct miraculous answers to prayer occur and can be rationally detected. Everything's just put on the sugar pill, the placebo effect. That's the only reason that prayer might work. People get their voices back or are completely cured from MS. Those just happen to coincide certainly with prayer activity and the faithful and continuous prayer for them and the direct response to that. Well, probably not. Being cured of MS or preaching on stage about the sovereignty of God, healing of a voice completely that's been a neurological issue. Those two are hard to dismiss away by just that placebo effect. So thus, while there is a place for using a complementary view of integration, one must be very careful not to overuse it. Such overuse marginalizes Christianity.
Exactly. So this, I think, in Nancy Pearcey's book, we saw this, and she called this reduction, right? Where if we can reduce every event to some physical processes, then there's really we kind of can edge out God. And so that's what he's getting at here, right? We can dismiss the supernatural by trying to, reduce something to the physical processes. But again, in your pool example, notice, even if we try to reduce the whole movement of the balls to just the physical processes, that still doesn't work for us because there's the pool player that has a determined to put the ball in the hole, right? Yeah. And so, but the danger is we can just kind of overuse it, and we can use it to dismiss the supernatural. That's why he called it supernaturalizing the world.
Right. This is kind of, isn't it Zeno's paradox, where you're always taking half of the movement from the arrow, and you get to the pool ball, to the pool stick, well, to the movement of the stick. Well, then how did the stick move? Well, there was certain energy that was put into it. Well, how did the energy there? Well, it was attached to an arm. Well, how did the arm get there? And so you could just continually explain when at some point you're going to have to get back to the being behind the holder of that arm who ate the apple that could hit the pool cue that could sink the 8-ball into the pocket. That's so right. Yeah. So such overuse marginalizes Christianity. It marginalizes Christianity and allows Christianity contemporaries to hide behind the view of integration. Oh, I'm sure you're right, but let's remove God from the gaps here and just continue to have this explanation over and over again.
Yeah.
Okay, well then let's have the first explanation. Nothing was there to have the first explanation. Okay, well, good. That you've started off with nothing and you can't get to one.
Yeah, I think, so there's all kinds of illustrations of this, right, where we try to reduce everything. So that's really what he's getting at here. All right, so that is the complementary model, right, where we have two different complementary, non-interacting approaches, two different perspectives on the same thing. And by the way, they both are true from their perspective. They're just not the whole picture. That's what he's trying to get at. And the danger here is trying to put especially the physical processes over the
right. Well, and we can turn it against ourselves too, right? Like we can say, how did the rock get here? Well, it seemed to have traveled down this hill because of erosion. Well, but what caused it? Well, instead of saying it rained for thousands of years here to level this out, we just say God did it. Well, yeah, that's true in the sense that like he is the initial person that created the rock and the rain. But what we're trying to get to is the explanation of how did big rock from down here that's not sandstone come from all the way up there where all the sandstone is. So we can turn this against the Christian ideas as well too.
Right. So we need to be careful. All right. The third one then he calls the presuppositions approach. And he tells us that this approach is based on the belief that theology can support the presuppositions of science. So I think we've already seen this earlier in this book, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And vice versa. He says science requires metaphysical and epistemological foundations, right? And theology can justify or at least help to justify them. And as he mentions here, he argued earlier that many of the presuppositions of science, for instance, the existence of truth, the rational, orderly nature of reality, the adequacy of our senses and cognitive faculties, to know the external world, things like that, make sense, he tells us, and are easy to justify given the Christian theism, but are at odds with and without ultimate justification in a naturalistic worldview. right? So this is the presuppositional approach where we use, these various presuppositions, Christian theological presuppositions to support science, right? To give a foundation for science.
That's right. We like science. We're going to put it up on our shoulders and walk through Disney World so that they can see all the sights and sounds, and we're there holding it up. We appreciate that. Yes. Well, then also is the practical application model. Another approach believes that theology can fill out and add details to general principles in another discipline and vice versa. Further, theology can practically apply principles in another discipline and, again, vice versa. For example, theology teaches that fathers should not provoke their children to anger, Ephesians 6:4. Very good. Also, likewise, children, don't provoke your fathers to anger. It's helpful. It's good. But also then psychology can add important details about what this means by offering information about family systems, the nature and causes of anger, ways to have proper motivations, ways to counteract and to interrupt, negative experiences. You're not going to find that within Ephesians 6:4 A, B, and C until you get to 5. But these are, again, the tools that God gives us by being people, discovering things, knowing things, being beings that are made in His image. That, again, the sola scriptura aspect of it comes out. It doesn't limit us to knowing other things outside of scripture.
All right, yeah, so that's the practical application model. And then he says there's a direct interaction model. And he says in this model, propositions, theories, and methodologies in theology and other disciplines such as science may directly interact with each other, either positively or negatively. And he says one area of study might offer rational support for the other, or one area of study might raise rational difficulties for the other. For example, he says certain theological teachings about the existence of the soul raise rational problems for philosophical or scientific claims that deny the existence of the soul, and vice versa. And so likewise, he says the general theory of evolution raises various difficulties for certain ways of understanding the book of Genesis, and vice versa. So this is the direct interaction model, right? And they may, interact with each other either positively or negatively, and they may support or go against the other particular perspective. Right?
Mm-hmm. And so application here is important to look at. And so he says, by way of application to current debates about intelligent design theory and theistic evolution, it may be helpful to note that the intelligent design movement is an example of applying the direct interaction model, while theistic evolution is a result of applying the complementarian approach. The direct interaction view requires a high view of rational justification of theological and philosophical claims consistent with Christianity. So he says, why do I say this? Because advocates of this position are willing to accept, use, defend, and go toe-to-toe with claims from other disciplines, including the majority of scientists, that seem inconsistent with or that seem to undermine a Christian worldview. So, the not quite war, but the disagreement between answers in Genesis and biologos tends to be that dichotomy, right?
Yeah.
You have biologos tends to be whatever evolution says, it doesn't discount God per se. And then on the complete opposite end, you have Answers in Genesis, which is intelligent design in fullness. It's creationism through and through. So those two camps tend to illustrate this.
He tells us, however, that this approach can place and often places Christian claims outside the mainstream of academic thought. So the idea here really is conflict, right? The two views are conflicting with one another. And so this can place Christian claims outside the mainstream of academic thought and pits Christians against the majority of experts trained in the relevant fields like biology and paleontology and anthropology and so on regarding intelligent design and evolution. And he says, in general, usually it is wise to follow the views of the majority of experts in a field. And he says we certainly do that when, for instance, our doctor tells us that the best treatment for some disease is X, Y, and Z, right? So the question he raises then is, why isn't it irrational to go against the majority of experts in embracing, for example, intelligent design instead of evolutionary theory, right? Most of the experts embrace evolutionary theory instead of intelligent design. And in general, it's wise to follow the majority of experts. So why isn't it irrational in this case to go against the majority of experts? And he's going to talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, this one reminds me of a different counterpoint book, and it's kind of within the same vein. It's the Four Views of Christianity and Philosophy, where it talks about this type of kind of conflict model and convergent model. Tim McGrew and Scott Oliphant are kind of the big names in there. Graham Oppie is in there as well. And so from a philosophical point of view, this how to handle Christianity in the mix of all these competing or complementary worldviews came out really well too. All right, so what's the rational criteria for going against the experts? Oh, don't we love going against the experts now? This is in vogue now. So here, using the evolution versus intelligent design controversy as an example, he's going to suggest that when 4 criteria are met, and he believes they are actually met in this controversy, one is rationally justified in embracing intelligent design theories of the origin and development of life and rejecting the blind watchmaker thesis, even though the latter is held by almost all experts in relevant scientific fields like biology. And so, again, why should this be the case? That there's so many people that have spoken, against this. A majority of people hold to it until the one doesn't, and then another doesn't, and another, and another, and soon, guess what? You have ellipses orbits, and you're able to track planets, and we're able to send men to the moon because those few people disagreed with the experts. And so that's not always going to be the case, but because science allows for those things and actually encourages those things, or at least it used to before, I was going to say 5 years ago, but we'll give it 20 years ago. That was the thing to do. That's the thing to try and do instead of silencing and having to do apologies, not apologetics, but apologies for any dissent among everybody.
Yeah. All right. So this section now, he wants to cover then these rational criteria for going against the experts. When should we go against the experts? What allows us to say, no, I'm going to go against the experts? The experts are wrong or may be wrong in this instance, right? And especially he's going to focus on, the idea of intelligent design and evolution. So the first thing he says is the very first thing is we need to make sure that there's not an alternative interpretation of the Bible that is interpretively reasonable and that resolves the tension. So if there's a tension between the two different positions, we want to make sure that our interpretation of the Bible is correct. And there may be an interpretation of the Bible that allows for both positions to be held, right? Now, probably not in this case, but that's one way to look at it. So that's the first thing. Make sure that there's not an alternative interpretation of the Bible that is reasonable and that resolves the tension between the two positions. All right. Secondly, he says, here's the second kind of criteria for going against the experts. When the presence of a band of highly trained, academically qualified scholars with a good track record for publishing in top journals or with highly regarded book publishers, and who are unified in rejecting the view, right, in this instance, the blind watchmaker thesis, and perhaps the thesis of common descent, are held by a vast majority of the relevant experts. So this criteria, he tells us, assures us that intelligent design theory is defensible and very plausible. So what's the second one? Well, when you have scholars on the other side who are academically qualified, published, highly regarded with regard to their publications and that sort of thing, then that is a reason to go against what we call the experts, in this particular issue. Right. So we have experts against experts. Right. So now we choose between the experts. And how do we choose that? Well, who has the best arguments and who has the best reasons for their position?
And again, the underpinnings of the Christian worldview has helped to establish even these criteria that ultimately kick them out. So this wanton desire to constantly get better, it's embedded within the system. So, a group of YouTubers can get together and agree upon certain things. And while those might start to move the conversation to this alternate theory against the experts, it's really going to be people who are set in a discipline, who have good methods, who are able to reproduce certain techniques, who are able to find agreement, who are able to publish within people with high academic qualifications of publishing. And so, again, it's working within the system that was helped created from the Christian worldview here. So he says, if you look at the resumes of top advocates of intelligent design, they all have 1 or 2 doctorates from well-regarded universities, and their writing are rigorous, scholarly, and very well informed. The amount of people who have come out since the 1995 kind of big push for intelligent design has been growing. In fact, it's been even more growing. People like Behe with Darwin's Black Box, and just everyone associated with kind of Behe's group have really kind of pushed this idea of well-regarded scientists who have kind of moved forward and said, hey, evolution might not be the only explanation, or there might be major issues within this, and has been slowly picking up steam. In fact, people from that group have gone on, Joe Rogan to talk about it and made convincing argumentations and written books about this. Well, moreover, they have more of a robust intellectual case for intelligent design and have provided strong negative defenses against critics of intelligent design and the arguments they employ. So it's easy to see the reasons for this criteria. If there were no highly trained PhDs who provided a sophisticated alternative to naturalistic and theistic evolution, and those who demonstrate familiarity with the expert majority view and have responded to their criticisms and experience, that would present the Christian community with a real problem. And so, what if you're right, why don't you have anybody on your side? Well, we do. We do.
Yeah. All right. So again, we're talking about, the rational criteria for going against the so-called experts, right? And he says, first of all, make sure that, there's not an alternative biblical interpretation so that there is no conflict. Secondly, if you have other highly trained experts that, against the particular majority opinion, that's a reason why you can do it. Thirdly, he says, when there are good historical, sociological, or theological explanations, notice, for why the expert majority holds to the problematic view, in this case, evolution, instead of their adherence to the problematic view being largely a rational commitment based on a lot of good arguments and strong evidence. All right, so now he's going to pursue this. So notice this third one. There are good historical, sociological, or theological explanations for why the experts hold the particular problematic view that they hold. And so he's going to explain each one of these.
Right. Well, historically, it is very plausible that the shift from creationism to evolution was the publication of Charles Darwin was not a function of evidence. Rather, it was an expression of the desire to get rid of theology and science, especially in biology, geology, and paleontology, and thus to naturalize the study of science.
Wait. I thought it was about finch beak sizes.
Just those
Isn't
finch.
that-
Yeah. The
beagle.
right.
This finch beak has one size of a beak, and this finch beak is another size. There's your evidence, right?
If only we kept the USS Beagle out at sea, or the HMS Beagle out at sea, it would have solved a lot of problems. Yeah. Look at the people that helped Darwin publish The Origin of Species and the reasons behind that. And Darwin he popularized it. He didn't come up with this one. And in fact, now it's passé for Darwin's ideas, specifically that type of evolution thinking within it. But that was the big push there. So Darwin predicted hundreds of thousands of transitional species, but the fossil record contains none, or perhaps more charitably, very few. Okay, the Lucy. Well, her jawbone was over here, and then 3 miles away was the femur. Oh, look, she died and then lost her jaw 3 miles away somehow. But we shaved down the hip bone to really allow her to have upright walking. Well, I'm pretty sure she could have walked upright without shaving her hip bone, but okay, I mean, if you want to take all these ideas and put them together, and then it was like 3 weeks before the grant money was set to dry up, and lo and behold, you find this big thing that then a lot of people harp on. Or how about blood vessels in dinosaur bones, right? There's no of this, right?
Well, those are some hardy blood vessels, right?
Yeah. And so all these types of predictions with these evidences that have come out, there has to be an explanation for it. Or you have Piltdown Man, which is like a pig's tooth, but people are so quick to want to harp on it because of Darwin's predictions here of this the bones that litter the graveyards in history should have these small variations that you can detect and make almost a walking from the fish to the hunched over person to the standing person, and then whatever we become next should be evident there. But they're not. The fact that for most of animals' parts needs a lot of other parts before they can function could be explained easily by creationism, but not by evolution. I think is it Behe who has the mousetrap idea?
Yeah.
You can only take so many parts away from the mousetrap before the mousetrap doesn't do the job.
Irreducibly complex.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So historically, then, he says the shift was not a function of evidence. There was huge predictions that Darwin had that didn't come true. The evidence shows that, we can use the Behe, irreducible complex argument there, right? So there's an issue there. He says it's hard to see the survival value of a slow, for instance, gradual development of species that goes through periods when only some of the relevant parts exist, and thus that the group of parts cannot function to convey survival value, right? And again, this is Behe's irreducible complexity. And thus, historically, then, the shift from creationism to Darwinism was primarily, he tells us, though not exclusively, a shift in philosophy of science, not, he's suggesting, as a result of the evidence. He says methodological naturalism replaced appeals to evidence of God's actions as legitimate scientific explanations. In other words, we need to make sure that we take God out of the picture and that we explain things naturalistically. And so we won't look at any evidence that would suggest that God is part of the deal, right? And he says that philosophy of science is one of the issues that was going on here.
Well, lots of good history that can be uncovered in that area. And Answers in Genesis has done a really good job of exposing a lot of that too. All right, how about the sociological explanations for why the majority of scientists accept evolution without adequate rational justification for doing so is the way in which science textbooks are written and young science students are socialized into the study of science. Students are not presented with any defeaters of evolutionary theory. Rather, the social process of becoming a scientist is one that tries to force harmony and homogeny regarding naturalistic evolution and methodological naturalism. Ask your local college biology professor how many books by intelligent design advocates they have read and what arguments they found most powerful against evolution. You'll probably be met with a deer in the headlights look. Well, there's only one explanation. Well, why? How about this one? How about Behe? How about Scott Myers? All these people of this group who have written extensively. How about these transitional fossils? Why haven't we found any? Well, just because, or there might be explanations, but there's no attempt to even answer it because there's only the one answer, and so
it's just a fact,
right?
There are no other explanations because it's a fact.
But I will say, you ask any high school homeschooler if they've read The Origin of Species, and I would say a good majority of them would probably raise their hand in that. I know that's something that our homeschool group will do, and I definitely encourage it because we want to give both sides the time there to present their answer.
Right. All right, so there's a sociological explanation. So historically, there's been no real evidence. It's been just a shift in philosophy of science. Sociologically, there's been social pressure to homogenize and harmonize, all the folks studying science. Finally, he says there are theological explanations for the acceptance of evolution by the experts. And go figure, right? Theological explanations.
Wait, you're saying the Christian worldview might explain why people reject the Christian worldview?
Yeah, go figure. He says an acceptance that goes far beyond the evidence. It feels almost like a religious commitment. These theological reasons are, at least in the case of naturalistic evolutionists, amount to a desire to destroy Christianity. So he tells us that in a rare moment of candor, atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says this, and this is kind of an interesting quote.
Yeah.
He says, this is Nagel. He says, I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy for the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope that there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us how you really feel.
One of the reasons why my copy of Mitch Stokes' How to Be an Atheist is so beat up is because I continuously open it up to hunt those quotes just like that one that he has in that book. So if you want more of those awesome quotes, like, what does the nihilist do when faced with hardships? Well, drugs. Drugs is the only answer. There's so many pharmaceutical pills to take into your body for explanation or for help with when nothing matters. So those are good to mine from that book. All right, so in summation, then, historically, evolution gave scientists a way to get God out of theology and get God and theology out of the science. Take it over. We don't have to deal with those competing views, and now we can shape it. And I'll let the conspiracy theories stay within my own head for more explanation for why that might be the case. Sociologically, there was a social pressure from the science community to remain homogenous, with groupthink about evolution, and with social punishment metered out to those who give the slightest hint that they are considering the plausibility of intelligent design theory. The example I always bring up is that Nature article where a translated Japanese science paper translated something like the hand of God. And there was a retraction and letters and oh my goodness, we're so sorry. We didn't mean to suggest anything possibly like this. It was a mistranslation. And it's like, well, guys, settle down. Like it's sometimes just a turn of a phrase, but all right, So many people reading Nature are suddenly going to start questioning it. Yeah. All right. And theologically, the cosmic authority problem means that many academics in science don't want there to be a God, and evolution gives them a way to be a naturalist. Thus, the widespread agreement among scientists, experts about the credibility of evolution can be explained in this way. It's not the strength of the evidence and the arguments that provide the primary rational support for evolution and against intelligent design. No, the primary explanation for expert agreement about evolution is historical, sociological, and theological.
All right. So we're working our way now through these various criteria for going against the, against the experts, right? And he's given us first, check your interpretation of the Bible. Secondly, if you have experts on the other side, that's a good reason, right? Thirdly, this whole idea of historical, sociological, and theological explanations driving the experts to their particular position. And now, fourthly, he says, given that Christianity is a highly rational worldview with much evidential and argumentative support, any view, he tells us, that cuts against central components of a Christian worldview should be rejected precisely due to that effect. So that's kind of an interesting claim here, right? Mm-hmm. Christianity is so strong, the position, the worldview, it has so much argumentative and evidential support that something that goes against it should. Now, he kind of doesn't really bite the bullet here. He doesn't say should be, considered, questioned. He says should be rejected, right? He says Christianity is a worldview that enjoys a tremendous amount of rational justification, evidence, and argumentative approach. And given that fact, it is rational, he tells us, to reject a potential defeater of Christianity precisely because it cannot withstand being weighted against the significant, high rational support of a Christian worldview. He says there may come a time when an aspect of a Christian worldview will need to be rejected, but this is not the time, and evolution is not a sufficient defeater. Yeah. Here it is, right?
That's a bold claim. It's something that, I don't know, J.P. Moreland doesn't seem to be like the person that would make that, but that's kind of a street preacher type response there.
You go, JP.
All right. Well, what's the conclusion of all this? He says that he believes that the information in this chapter provides solid advice on how to think about Christianity and science, particularly intelligent design theory and the blind watchmaker theory. So he says, if I'm right about this, then this information will give us a way to go forward.
All right. So there it is. That's kind of the final chapter of this book on scientism and secularism. And he gives us kind of an illustration and a way to hold to, various Christians' belief, especially with regard to this intelligent design evolutionary argument. He has two more pages, right? At the very end of the book that he calls one final plea. And so what is it here? Well, so let's look at his one final plea. He says in this book, he's endeavored to make numerous rational arguments with careful definitions about the nature of scientism. After carefully considering scientism's claim, he's come to the conclusion that it's not science, that it undermines science, and that it encourages people to misuse science, and that because it is so widely believed, it ends up hurting Christians who buy into its deceptive lies, he tells us. And so the disastrous implications of the secularization of our culture, with scientism being the primary mover here, are largely due to evangelical ignorance of this issue. Scientism, he says, is a silent yet deadly killer of Christianity. But the evidence presented in this book, he believes, provides part of a successful inoculation against scientism. please, he pleads, do not fail to act on what you have read. So there's his final plea.
Yeah. So just because someone can put on a lab coat, put a stethoscope around their neck, doesn't mean that you have to fully trust them as the only source of truth for being a doctor there. So
there you go. Yeah, or anything.
Right, exactly. And I think the secondary effects that we see in the world today are probably a good indicator of his strong position of accepting the Christian worldview, but that's probably for a different book. All right, well, that is book 13 from Cave to the Cross Apologetics, and so next time we'll film a little intro to our next book. We've got it all picked out, and now we just got to get a little bit ahead of you. Although for us, we're going back to the future for us. So we'll just have to try and remember all the brain cells that we lost along the way there. So book 14 announcement will be next, and then we'll give you time to get the book or whatever it might be, and then we'll go from there. So thanks always for joining us. Thanks for checking us out. The shorts, the reels, whatever you call them, things that stop our ability to get chunks of 30 minutes at 2x speed. Those are all nice to see people checking out, and people, I think, finally understanding when we say scientism, we don't actually mean science there. So thanks for checking all those out. And you can go to caveofthecross.com and check out all previous 13 books that we've covered so far, and stay tuned for book number 14. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.